The kintsugi room at Ethelgard was less a dining suite and more a sanctuary of gilded silence. It existed on the 54th floor, a glass box suspended over the sprawling, glittering nervous system of New York City. The decor was a carefully curated collision of cultures, a tense marriage between minimalist Japanese design and opulent Western luxury. A single ancient bonsai tree stood in a corner, its gnarled branches a testament to centuries of patient cultivation, while above a chandelier of Venetian crystal hung like a frozen constellation, scattering fractured rainbows across the polished obsidian table. The air itself seemed different here, filtered and heavy with the scent of old money, expensive leather, and the faintest, most decadent whisper of white truffles from the kitchen below. This was a place where fortunes were made and empires were broken, where the clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain was often the only sound accompanying a multi-billion-dollar deal. It was a stage, and tonight a particularly venomous drama was set to unfold, witnessed only by the silent, judging skyline. Into this arena of power moved Akari Tanaka, her presence a study in deliberate invisibility. Her uniform, a simple, tailored black dress with a crisp white apron, was designed to be forgotten, a functional camouflage that allowed her to glide between tables unnoticed. Her movements were economical and precise, each step measured, each gesture fluid and practiced. She poured still water into crystal glasses with a hand that never trembled, her posture perfect, her expression a placid mask of professional deference. To the titans of industry who frequented this room, she was part of the decor, a silent automaton programmed for service. But beneath the starched fabric and the polite, vacant smile, a storm of memory and purpose was raging. Her eyes, which seemed to see nothing, saw everything. They absorbed the subtle shift in a guest's posture, the tightening of a jaw, the almost imperceptible flicker of unease in a negotiation. She was not a servant, she was a scholar in a laboratory of her own design, and every night was a new experiment in the corrupting nature of absolute power. As the chilled water filled the glass of the empty seat at the head of the table, Akari's mind was not on her task but 5 years and 7,000 miles away. The image of her grandfather, Kenji Tanaka, surfaced, not as the frail man she now cared for, but as he was before, a giant of industry with eyes that held the wisdom of generations and hands that could sketch the blueprint for the future on a simple napkin. He had taught her the art of keigo, the most formal and honorific level of the Japanese language, explaining that true strength was not in shouting, but in the respect one could command through nuance and grace. That vibrant image was violently erased by the memory of a phone call, the clinical voice of a doctor explaining the devastating effects of a massive stroke. The cause, the doctor had said, was extreme stress, a direct result of the brutal, hostile takeover of Tanaka Innovations by an American private equity firm, Apex Holdings. The name had been a death sentence, and it had seared itself into Akari's very soul. She had abandoned her promising career in Tokyo, crossed an ocean, and taken this humble job, all to be near the man whose life had been shattered, and to position herself in the very heart of the world that had devoured him. The heavy doors of the kintsugi room swung open, and the atmosphere shifted instantly, the gilded silence curdling into something tense and expectant. Preston Hayes did not walk into a room, he conquered it. He was a man sculpted from arrogance and ambition, dressed in a bespoke suit so dark it seemed to absorb the light around him. A Patek Philippe watch, worth more than a suburban home, glinted on his wrist as he waved a dismissive hand at the maître d'. He carried with him the sharp, aggressive scent of a cologne that announced his arrival long before he spoke, a scent that bulldozed the subtle, refined aromas of the restaurant. He did not look at Akari, his eyes sweeping over her as if she were a coat rack. But she felt his presence like a drop in barometric pressure, a physical weight in the air. A cold, familiar fury began to solidify in her veins, not hot and reckless, but icy and patient. This was him. The architect of her family's ruin, the ghost that haunted her grandfather's vacant eyes, and he had no idea he had just walked into his own execution. Following Hayes were 2 elderly Japanese gentlemen, their movements a stark contrast to his aggressive stride. They were his prospective investors, the gatekeepers to a multi-billion-dollar fund he desperately needed. They moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, their dark, conservative suits immaculate, their faces serene and difficult to read. They bowed slightly to the room itself, a gesture of respect Hayes either didn't see or didn't understand. Akari watched as Hayes directed them to their seats with an impatient gesture, his body language screaming his frustration with their unhurried pace. He saw them as obstacles, ancient relics whose quaint customs were a waste of his valuable time. Akari, however, saw the truth. She recognized the subtle, intricate dance of Japanese business etiquette. A language spoken in silence, in the depth of a bow, in the way one accepted a business card. It was a language Hayes was deaf and blind to, and his ignorance was the cornerstone of the trap she had so carefully laid. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. A battle not of finances but of character is about to take place in the heart of New York City, and a ruthless billionaire is about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is the one you never see coming. We're about to witness this incredible story unfold, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your city or country below, and if you enjoy stories where justice is served with ice-cold precision, make sure you're subscribed to join our community. The meeting began, and for 20 excruciating minutes, Preston Hayes endured what he considered to be an infuriating waste of time. The Japanese investors, Mr. Yoshida and Mr. Sato, spoke in quiet, measured tones, asking thoughtful, indirect questions about long-term vision and corporate philosophy. Frustration began to radiate from Hayes in palpable waves. He checked his watch twice in 5 minutes. Finally, unable to contain his contempt any longer, he turned to his American associate, a younger, sycophantic man named David, and switched to English, assuming the two Japanese men understood nothing. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial growl, a sound that still carried with perfect clarity in the room's acoustics. He complained about the kabuki theater of it all, mocking their deliberate pace and calling their methods archaic. He was the shark, he explained, and they were fossils, and he was tired of having to pretend to respect their ancient, irrelevant ways. All the while, Akari stood near the wall, a silent statue, her face a perfect mask of professional neutrality as she refilled a water glass. Every culturally insensitive word, every drop of poison that dripped from his tongue was a gift. He was not just showing his true colors, he was handing her the very weapon she needed to destroy him. The final insult, the one that would seal his fate, came when Akari moved to place a small plate of amuse-bouche on the table. Hayes watched her with open disdain, her simple, focused task seeming to amplify his own towering importance. He let out a short, humorless laugh, gesturing toward her with his fork as he spoke to David. "See?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Even she gets it. Simple jobs for simple minds. No need for all this pointless ceremony, just get it done." The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. For Hayes, it was a throwaway comment, a casual assertion of his superiority over the service staff. But for Akari, it was the final, critical piece of data she needed. The insult did not wound her pride. It was far too late for that. Instead, it triggered a cascade of images in her mind. Her grandfather's hand, once so strong, now lying limp on a white hospital sheet. The for sale sign being hammered into the lawn of her childhood home, the hollowed-out look in her father's eyes. This wasn't about her. This was about a man so blinded by his own perceived greatness that he could not see the humanity in anyone he deemed beneath him. The American associate David let out a nervous, obsequious chuckle, eager to please his boss. The two Japanese investors, however, remained perfectly still. To Preston Hayes, their impassive faces signified ignorance, or, at best, polite confusion. He was entirely wrong. Akari, fluent in the silent language of her culture, saw what he could not. She saw the microscopic tightening around Mr. Yoshida's eyes, the almost imperceptible downward turn of Mr. Sato's mouth. It was not confusion she saw. It was confirmation. They had seen the soul of the man who wished to manage their legacy, and it was rotten to the core. The test was complete. Akari stood by the table, the weight of the crystal water pitcher in her hand feeling solid and real in a world that had become surreal. The billionaire had just finished his monologue, utterly convinced of his victory, while the invisible waitress who held his fate in her hands had not yet spoken a single word. The gilded silence of the kintsugi room held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The last, dismissive words from Preston Hayes hung in the air, a foul vapor in the sanitized atmosphere of the kintsugi room. He expected Akari to retreat, to vanish back into the shadows of service from which she had emerged. But she did not move. Instead, something profound and almost imperceptible shifted in her very essence. It began with her posture. The slight, deferential curve of her spine, a posture honed over months of deliberate invisibility, began to straighten. It was not a sudden, defiant act, but a slow, graceful uncoiling, like a banner being unfurled for battle. Her shoulders, which had always been held in a way that suggested apology for the space she occupied, squared with a quiet, unshakable authority. Her head, previously bowed, lifted. Her gaze, once carefully averted, now moved with deliberate intent, a searchlight finding its target. The change was so complete, so fundamental, that it altered the very energy in the room. The low hum of the city outside seemed to fade, and the clinking of cutlery from the main dining hall fell silent. Every eye was drawn to her, this woman who had been nothing more than a piece of functional decor, and was now, suddenly, the absolute center of gravity in a room full of powerful men. With all attention now fixed upon her, Akari turned her body slightly, a pivot of immense significance. She did not face Preston Hayes. Instead, she turned to the two Japanese investors, Mr. Yoshida and Mr. Sato. She brought her hands together before her, not in a gesture of supplication, but of formal address. She took a small, respectful step forward and bowed, a deep, precise inclination from the waist that was a world away from the perfunctory nod of a service worker. And then she spoke. The words that emerged from her were not the simple, functional English of a waitress. It was the silken, intricate, and deeply resonant sound of keigo, the most formal and honorific level of the Japanese language. Her voice was low, clear, and carried the weight of centuries of tradition. She apologized, not for any failure in service, but on behalf of the establishment for the profound disrespect they had been forced to endure. She spoke of honor, of patience, and of the disappointment that such a display of crudeness could have occurred in a place meant for civilized discourse. The cadence of her speech was flawless, the honorifics perfectly chosen, a linguistic masterpiece that was both a sincere apology to them and a devastating indictment of the American at the table. Preston Hayes stared, his mouth slightly agape, a forkful of seared scallop frozen halfway to his lips. His mind, a finely tuned machine for calculating profit and loss, could not process this new data. A waitress speaking Japanese? It was an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of his perfectly ordered world. He initially dismissed it as some bizarre theatrical flourish, perhaps a desperate attempt by the restaurant to impress his guests. He looked at his associate, David, for confirmation, a smirk beginning to form on his lips, ready to make a joke about the lengths some places would go to for a good tip. But the smirk died before it was born. He saw the expressions on the faces of Mr. Flepp, Yoshida, and Mr. Sato. They were not confused or amused. They were listening with rapt attention, their bodies angled slightly toward Akari. And then, in a gesture that sent a jolt of pure, cold dread through Hayes's veins, Mr. Yoshida, the elder of the two, inclined his head and responded to her in the same formal, respectful Japanese. He thanked her for her consideration and acknowledged the difficulty of the situation. It was a conversation, a dialogue from which Hayes was utterly and completely excluded. The world began to tilt beneath Preston Hayes's feet, the solid ground of his own superiority, the bedrock of his entire existence, was fracturing. The two old men, the fossils he had been mocking just moments before, were communicating with the waitress in a language he could not comprehend, and they were showing her more respect than they had shown him throughout the entire agonizing meeting. He was no longer the shark in the tank. He was a spectator on the outside, his face pressed against the glass, watching a game whose rules he had never bothered to learn. The carefully constructed reality of the room had been inverted. The power, which he believed emanated from his end of the table, had shifted, silently and completely, to the woman in the simple black dress. He watched as she concluded her exchange with the investors, who both gave her a final, deep bow of acknowledgement. The gesture was so profound, so laden with meaning, that it was like a physical blow. They were not bowing to a waitress, they were bowing to an equal. Then she turned to him. The transformation was complete. The placid mask of the servant was gone, replaced by an expression of cold, analytical neutrality. The eyes that had so carefully avoided his gaze now met it head-on, and he felt as if he were being X-rayed, his soul laid bare and found wanting. She switched back to English, but her voice was unrecognizable. The soft, deferential tone had been stripped away, leaving behind a voice that was as clear and sharp as cut crystal. There was no anger in it, no heat of emotion. There was only the chilling finality of a verdict being delivered. She spoke his name, and the sound of it in this new voice made him flinch. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her enunciation perfect, each syllable a precisely placed stone building a wall between them. "My grandfather, Kenji Tanaka, sends his regards." The name hit him like a phantom limb, an ache from a distant, violent amputation. Tanaka. Tanaka Innovations. A ghost from a 5-year-old massacre. A name he had buried under a mountain of profit and willful forgetting. The blood drained from his face as the pieces began to click into place with the horrifying sound of a cell door slamming shut. The waitress, this ghost in a black uniform, continued, her voice unwavering. He wanted to personally witness the character of the man seeking to manage his family's wealth. He felt the air leave his lungs, a silent, strangled gasp. His family's wealth. Not some anonymous investment fund. It was their money. He had been performing, posturing, and ultimately insulting the very people he had come to court, believing them to be intermediaries. He had been auditioning for the man whose life and company he had eviscerated. The two gentlemen at the table, she gestured toward them with a subtle, respectful inclination of her head, are not fund managers. They are his most trusted advisors, men who have stood by his side for over 40 years. They were here simply to observe, to bear witness. And then came the final devastating words, delivered with the serene calm of an executioner. "The meeting is over, Mr. Hayes. Your test results are in." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air, all the sound, all the arrogance out of Preston Hayes, leaving behind nothing but a hollowed-out shell of a man, exposed and humiliated in a glass box 54 floors above a city that suddenly felt like it was watching and laughing. For a long moment, Preston Hayes could not speak. His mind, usually a whirlwind of aggressive strategy and predatory calculation, was a blank, roaring void. Disbelief was the first wave to crash against the shore of his consciousness. This had to be a joke, an elaborate, insane prank. He looked from Akari's calm, unreadable face to the serene, almost pitying expressions of the two Japanese advisors. There was no joke here. This was real. The second wave was rage, a volcanic, primal fury that began in the pit of his stomach and rose up his throat like molten lava. He had been played. He, Preston Hayes, the master of the universe, the man who broke companies and bent markets to his will, had been tricked, tested, and judged by a waitress. The sheer, unadulterated humiliation of it was more than he could bear. The carefully maintained facade of the sophisticated corporate titan cracked, and the ugly, brutish creature beneath began to claw its way out. His face, which had been pale with shock, now flooded with a dark, mottled red. A vein pulsed violently in his temple, a visible measure of the storm breaking within him. He finally found his voice, and it came out as a strangled, guttural bark. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he spat, the words clumsy and thick with fury. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping violently against the polished floor, a sound as jarring as a scream in the gilded silence. He was trying to reassert his dominance, to use his physical presence and the force of his voice to shrink her back into the nothingness he believed she belonged to. He was the billionaire, she was the help. That was the natural order of the world, and he would not allow it to be upended. But Akari did not shrink. She stood her ground, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. She did not need to raise her voice or trade insults. Her victory was already total and absolute. Her silence in the face of his tantrum was more powerful than any retort. It was the silence of a judge who had already passed sentence and was now merely waiting for the condemned to finish his final, pathetic outburst. His rage was irrelevant. The game was already over. The two Japanese advisors, Mr. Yoshida and Mr. Sato, had seen enough. With a quiet, synchronized grace, they both rose from their chairs. They carefully folded their napkins and placed them beside their untouched plates. They did not spare Preston Hayes a single glance. It was the most profound and complete dismissal he had ever experienced in his life. It was as if he had ceased to exist. They walked toward Akari, and as they passed her, each man stopped and performed another deep, formal bow. It was a gesture of immense respect, a public declaration of allegiance. They were not just validating her, they were anointing her. Their silent, dignified exit from the kintsugi room was the final nail in the coffin of Hayes's ambition. The multi-billion-dollar deal he had been counting on, the key to his next great conquest, was walking out the door, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. He was left alone, standing in a room that suddenly felt vast and empty, with the object of his humiliation. His inability to harm her intellectually or financially in that moment, combined with the public shaming he had just endured, caused his rage to short-circuit. It needed a target, an outlet, and it found the only one available. Since he could not attack her true identity, he attacked her disguise. He pointed a trembling finger at her, his face contorted in a mask of pure venom. "You!" he screamed, his voice cracking with the strain. "You're fired!" The words echoed in the room, childish and pathetic. It was the desperate act of a king who had lost his kingdom, but still believed he could command his servants. He bellowed for the manager, his voice a raw, wounded roar. "Get her out of my sight! Get this thing out of here now!" It was a tantrum of epic proportions, the complete and utter meltdown of a man who had never been told no, who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. He was trying to claw back some semblance of control, to prove that he still had power over someone, even if it was just a waitress. The restaurant manager, a man named Jean-Pierre who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, came rushing in, his face a mess of panic and confusion. He had heard the shouting, and his primary instinct was to placate the source of the noise, especially when that source was a man who could likely buy the entire building with his pocket change. He saw Preston Hayes, his face purple with rage, and his gaze immediately shifted to Akari, the presumed cause of the disruption. He began to stammer apologies to Hayes, his hands fluttering nervously. "Sir, I am so sorry. Whatever the issue is, we will handle it immediately." He turned to Akari, his expression a mixture of fear and stern disapproval. He saw only a subordinate who had catastrophically overstepped her bounds. He took her gently but firmly by the arm, preparing to escort her from the room, to offer her up as a sacrifice to appease the angry god in the bespoke suit. He was completely unaware that he was manhandling the most powerful person in the room. For Akari, the manager's touch, his fearful apologies to Hayes, and the public spectacle of her dismissal were not a source of shame. She felt a strange, serene sense of detachment. This moment, this final petty act of vengeance from a broken man, was a necessary part of the process. It was the closing of a chapter. Being fired from this job was not an end. It was a graduation. She had completed her field research. She had gathered her primary evidence. The uniform she wore was no longer camouflage. It was a chrysalis from which she was about to emerge. She allowed Jean-Pierre to lead her toward the door, her movements calm and deliberate. She did not struggle or protest. Her mind was already miles away, calculating the next steps, formulating the strategy for the war that was to come. The loss of this $10 an hour job was the price of admission to the arena, where she would finally achieve justice for her family. It was the best investment she had ever made. As she reached the doorway, a final, crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mr. Sato, the quieter of the two advisors, had been waiting just outside the entrance. As the manager bustled past him with Akari in tow, Mr. Sato extended his hand. For a fleeting second, it looked as if he were going to shake hers. But instead, with a movement so swift and subtle it was almost invisible, he pressed a small, rectangular object into her palm. Her fingers closed around it instinctively. It was a business card, thick and heavy, crafted from expensive cardstock with embossed lettering. He gave her a single meaningful nod, his eyes communicating a universe of support and determination, before turning and walking silently down the corridor. Akari did not need to look at the card to understand its significance. It was a weapon. It was funding. It was the formal declaration that the Tanaka family and all its immense hidden resources were now fully behind her. The manager led her through the bustling main dining room, past the curious stares of other patrons, and into the stark, fluorescent-lit confines of the staff corridor. Once out of sight of the clientele, his professional demeanor collapsed into exasperated anger. "What were you thinking, Tanaka?" he hissed, finally releasing her arm. "Do you have any idea who that was?" He continued to lecture her, his words a meaningless buzz in her ears. She was not listening. Her entire being was focused on the object in her hand, the weight and texture of it a tangible link to her future. She waited for him to finish his tirade, then simply nodded, handed him her name tag, and walked toward the staff exit without a word. She pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped out into the cool, damp air of a New York back alley. The chaotic symphony of the city, the blare of horns, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the subway beneath her feet, welcomed her back into the real world. She stood there for a moment, the grime and reality of the alley, a stark contrast to the gilded cage she had just left. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first truly free breath she had taken in months. The weight of her assumed identity, the constant, draining performance of being invisible, lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer Akari the waitress. She was Akari Tanaka, the granddaughter of Kenji Tanaka, and she was at war. She finally opened her hand and looked at the business card under the dim glow of a security light. The name embossed on it was Julian Croft. Beneath the name was a title, Senior Partner, Croft and Associates. And below that, a single, elegant line, Corporate Litigation and Hostile Takeover Defense. She knew the name. Everyone in the world of high finance knew the name. Julian Croft was a legend, a legal pit bull known as the Giant Killer. He was the lawyer you hired when you wanted to burn your enemy's empire to the ground and salt the earth. The card was not a suggestion, it was an order. A slow smile spread across Akari's face. It was not a smile of happiness, but of grim, resolute satisfaction. Preston Hayes, in his blind arrogance, thought he had won. He had fired the waitress. He had asserted his dominance. He was at that very moment probably celebrating his petty victory, believing the incident was over. He had no idea that what he had just done was not an execution, but an act of creation. He had taken a quiet, patient observer and, through his own cruelty and hubris, had forged her into an active and implacable adversary. He had given her a cause, a stage, and now, Through his own actions, he had inadvertently provided her with the very weapon she needed to begin his destruction. He had not fired a servant, he had unleashed a reckoning. The battle in the kintsugi room was over, but the war for the soul of her family's legacy was just beginning. Akari walked out of the alley and onto the crowded sidewalk, melting into the river of anonymous faces flowing through the city. But she was no longer anonymous. She was a woman with a name, a mission, and a very powerful new ally. The first phase of her plan was complete. She had confirmed Hayes's character, or rather, his profound lack of it. She had secured the full backing of her grandfather's advisors. And she now held the key to the legal machine that would tear Preston Hayes's world apart. The despair that had been her constant companion for 5 long years began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. The grief for her grandfather was still there, a hot coal in the center of her being, but it was no longer a weight that held her down. It was now fuel. It was the fire that would light her way through the darkness ahead. The path would be difficult and dangerous, but for the first time since the day her world fell apart, she saw the destination clearly. She did not go home. Instead, she hailed a cab and gave the driver an address in the financial district. The ride through the glittering canyons of Manhattan was a journey through enemy territory. These buildings, monuments to commerce and ambition, were the temples where men like Preston Hayes were worshipped. They were fortresses built of glass, steel, and legal loopholes, designed to protect the powerful and crush the weak. For years, she had felt like an outsider looking in, a victim of this ruthless world. But tonight, everything had changed. She was no longer a victim. She was an insurgent. She was armed with a truth that could bring the walls of these fortresses tumbling down. Her weapon was not just the knowledge of Hayes's fraud, but the knowledge of his soul. She knew his arrogance, his impatience, his bigotry, and she would use every single one of his character flaws against him. He had shown her his weaknesses, and she would exploit them without mercy. Her apartment, when she finally returned late that night, felt different. It was a small, sparsely furnished space in a modest building in Queens, a world away from the opulence of Ethelgard. The rent was paid with her meager waitress salary, a constant reminder of her fallen status. But tonight, it no longer felt like a refuge of shame. It felt like a war room. She spread her research out on the small kitchen table. Old financial reports from Tanaka Innovations, newspaper clippings about the Apex Holdings takeover, a detailed timeline of events she had been compiling for years. These were the relics of her family's ruin, the artifacts of her pain. Now they were the foundational documents of her counteroffensive. At the center of it all, she placed the business card of Julian Croft. It lay on the table like a key, gleaming under the cheap fluorescent light, a promise of the power she was about to unlock. Sleep was an impossibility. Her mind was a whirlwind of strategy and planning. The audio recording she had secretly made of the entire dinner meeting was the centerpiece of her initial evidence. It was a perfect, damning portrait of Preston Hayes, painted in his own words. His contempt for his investors, his racist mockery, his dismissive cruelty toward her, it was all there, captured in high-fidelity audio. But she knew it wasn't enough. To truly destroy him, to achieve real justice, she needed more than proof of his vile personality. She needed to unravel the complex web of financial fraud he had used to steal her grandfather's company. She needed to find the smoking gun that would lead not just to his public disgrace, but to his criminal indictment. The test in the restaurant had been a moral one. The test to come would be a battle of intellect, endurance, and sheer will. The following morning she made the call. She dialed the number on the business card, her heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against her ribs. When a crisp, professional voice answered, Akari did not hesitate. She used her full name, Akari Tanaka, and stated that she had been referred by Mr. Sato on a matter of extreme urgency regarding Apex Holdings. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then the voice returned, its tone noticeably warmer. Mr. Croft can see you at 2 o'clock this afternoon. The ease with which she had been granted an audience with one of the most sought-after lawyers in the country was a testament to the power she now wielded. The name Tanaka, once a source of pain and shame, was once again a key, unlocking doors that had been firmly shut to her. The invisible waitress was gone forever. She spent the hours before the meeting preparing meticulously. She organized her files, cross-referenced her notes, and prepared a concise, powerful summary of the case. She chose her attire with the same strategic care she had once used to choose her waitress uniform. She selected a simple, elegant, dark gray suit, professional and authoritative. It was the armor of the world she was re-entering, the world of boardrooms and high-stakes negotiation. As she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she saw not the ghost of the promising young executive she had once been, but a new woman, forged in the fires of grief and hardened by a singular, unyielding purpose. Her eyes, which had for so long been downcast and vacant, now held a sharp, intelligent fire. She was ready. The years of silent observation, of patient study in the belly of the beast, were over. It was time to act. The offices of Croft and Associates were the antithesis of the gaudy, ostentatious headquarters of Apex Holdings. They were located in a historic, understated building, the kind of place that whispered power rather than shouting it. The interior was filled with dark wood, leather-bound books, and an air of quiet, intellectual gravitas. It was a place built for thinking, for strategy, for the meticulous dismantling of powerful men. Julian Croft himself was exactly as she had imagined. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with sharp, discerning eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He gestured for her to sit and simply said, "Mr. Sato told me to expect your call. He said, you have a dragon that needs slaying. Tell me everything." His demeanor was gruff, skeptical, and intensely focused. He was a man who had heard 1,000 stories of injustice and was not easily impressed. Akari did not begin with an emotional appeal. She did not speak of her grandfather's stroke or her family's pain. She knew that pity was not a currency this man traded in. Instead, she opened her briefcase and began her presentation with the cool, dispassionate logic of the Wharton graduate she was. She laid out the timeline of the hostile takeover. She pointed to specific anomalies in the financial disclosures Apex Holdings had filed with the SEC. She outlined the smear campaign Hayes had launched in the financial press, a campaign designed to artificially drive down Tanaka Innovations' stock price. She spoke the language of numbers, of regulations, of legal precedent. She was not presenting herself as a victim seeking retribution. She was presenting herself as a client with a viable, data-driven case for massive financial fraud. She was demonstrating her value not just as the source of the case, but as a key asset in winning it. Julian Croft listened intently, his fingers steepled before him, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. He interrupted her occasionally with a pointed, incisive question, testing her knowledge, probing for weaknesses in her argument. Akari answered each question calmly and precisely, her encyclopedic memory of the events serving her well. She had lived and breathed this case for 5 years, and her command of the first official strategy session with Julian Croft was not a meeting of consolation or sympathy. It was a council of war. They convened in his private study, a room insulated from the city's noise by thick mahogany walls and shelves groaning under the weight of legal precedent. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and a faint, lingering trace of cigar smoke, the scent of 1,000 intellectual battles fought and won. Croft, a man whose placid exterior concealed a mind like a steel trap, sat behind a massive oak desk, his gaze sharp and analytical. He had listened to Akari's entire audio recording from the restaurant, his expression never changing, but his eyes had narrowed almost imperceptibly at the sheer, unvarnished arrogance of Preston Hayes. He confirmed what Akari already suspected. The recording was a character assassination tool of unparalleled power, perfect for swaying a board or poisoning the well of public opinion, but it was not, in itself, the silver bullet needed for a criminal conviction. It proved Hayes was a monster, but it did not legally prove he was a thief. The challenge, he explained, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, was that men like Hayes did not operate in the open. Their crimes were buried beneath layers of legal misdirection, offshore accounts, and shell corporations. a financial labyrinth designed by the most expensive lawyers in the world to be utterly impenetrable. To bring him down, they needed more than a recording of his bigotry. They needed the original blueprint of his fraud. Akari, seated across from him, was not intimidated by the monumental scale of the task. The years of forced humility had stripped away any youthful naivete, replacing it with a hardened, pragmatic resolve. She listened, absorbed, and processed, her mind already connecting Croft's legal framework to the deep, intuitive knowledge she possessed of Hayes's business practices. She began to speak, not as a grieving granddaughter, but as a senior analyst dissecting a hostile takeover. She detailed the specific subsidiaries Apex Holdings had used to acquire Tanaka Innovations, debt, the suspiciously timed reports from a supposedly neutral ratings agency, and the network of financial bloggers who had systematically spread disinformation in the weeks leading up to the buyout. She laid out a web of conspiracies so intricate and detailed that Croft, for the first time, leaned forward, a flicker of genuine admiration in his eyes. He realized then that he was not dealing with a mere client seeking vengeance. He was partnering with a brilliant strategist who had spent 5 years embedded in the field, gathering human intelligence with a patience he had rarely seen. He had the legal firepower, but she, he now understood, held the map to the heart of the enemy's territory. Their initial plan began to form, a two-pronged assault on Hayes's empire. Croft would handle the legal archaeology, assembling a team of forensic accountants to begin the painstaking process of excavating the 5-year-old financial records. Their job was to follow the money, no matter how convoluted the path. Akari's mission, however, was more delicate and far more dangerous. She was tasked with finding a human element, a crack in the wall of loyalty and fear that surrounded Preston Hayes. They needed an insider, someone from within Apex Holdings who had witnessed the crime and whose conscience might, with the right persuasion, outweigh their fear of retribution. Croft warned her of the immense risk. Hayes did not tolerate disloyalty. Anyone who spoke out would face not just financial ruin, but a campaign of personal destruction so vicious it would make them unemployable for life. This was not a task for a lawyer. It required a touch of empathy, a shared sense of injustice, and the ability to build trust where only terror had previously existed. It was a mission only Akari could accomplish, for she was not just fighting a case, she was fighting for a soul. The following days blurred into a relentless torrent of work. Croft's team established a secure off-site office, a sterile, anonymous space that became their war room. The walls were soon covered in whiteboards, filled with complex diagrams charting the flow of capital, lists of corporate entities, and timelines that connected seemingly unrelated events. The sheer volume of data was staggering. Apex Holdings had acquired dozens of companies over the years, and their filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission were a masterclass in obfuscation. Thousands of pages of dense legalese designed to confuse and exhaust anyone who dared to scrutinize them. Akari worked alongside the forensic accountants, her unique insight proving invaluable. She could see the ghost of her grandfather's business philosophy in the old Tanaka Innovations reports, a philosophy of long-term growth and ethical practice that stood in stark contrast to the slash-and-burn methodology of Apex. Every line item, every footnote, was a painful reminder of what had been lost, but she channeled her grief into a laser-like focus, refusing to rest, driven by a cold, righteous fury that burned brighter than any exhaustion. Weeks bled into a month, and the initial momentum began to wane, replaced by the grim reality of their undertaking. They were chasing shadows. Every promising lead, every suspicious transaction ultimately dissolved into a legal dead end. They traced millions of dollars to a holding company in the Cayman Islands, only to be met with an impenetrable wall of corporate privacy laws. They identified the analysts who wrote the damning reports on Tanaka Innovations, but found they had all been paid through third-party consulting firms that had since been dissolved. Preston Hayes had built a fortress, and its walls were proving to be every bit as strong as Croft had predicted. Doubt, a cold and insidious poison, began to seep into the war room. The accountants grew frustrated. the lawyers cautious. The sheer audacity of Hayes's scheme, its legal perfection, was almost admirable in its villainy. It was during these moments of despair that Akari's resolve was tested the most. She would close her eyes and see her grandfather's face, not the vacant, broken man in the nursing home, but the Titan who had taught her that patience and honor were the sharpest blades in any arsenal. His memory was her anchor in the storm, the unwavering light that guided her through the darkest hours of the investigation. While Croft's team wrestled with the digital ghost of the crime, Akari embarked on her own hunt, a far more personal and delicate search for a human one. She began building a list of former Apex Holdings employees, specifically those who had left the company in the year following the Tanaka takeover. She spent her days in quiet library archives, scrolling through microfiche of old business journals, and her nights navigating the complex social networks of the financial world. She was looking for a specific profile, not a high-level executive who was likely complicit, but a mid-level manager or accountant, someone with access to the details but not a seat at the table of power. She was searching for someone who had been discarded, someone who might harbor a grudge, someone whose loyalty to Hayes had been broken. It was a painstaking process, like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless beach. She made dozens of discreet inquiries, sent carefully worded emails, and followed every faint trail, most of which led to nothing more than fear and firmly closed doors. The name Preston Hayes was a specter that still terrified anyone who had ever worked for him. The breakthrough came not from a brilliant piece of detective work, but from a moment of shared human decency. Elena Rostova, a sharp, cynical corporate investigator Croft had brought onto the team, a woman who had made a career out of exposing corporate malfeasance, found a promising name. Marcus Thorne, a senior risk analyst at Apex who had been abruptly terminated about 18 months after the Tanaka acquisition. The official reason was a corporate restructuring, but the rumors Elena had unearthed suggested he had been fired for asking too many questions about irregularities in the accounting of the deal. He had since disappeared from the high-flying world of finance, now working as a simple accounting professor at a small community college in New Jersey. He had signed a draconian non-disclosure agreement, and according to Elena's sources, he was terrified of Hayes. Croft advised caution, suggesting a formal legal approach. Akari, however, knew that a lawyer's letter would only send him deeper into hiding. This required a human touch. She decided to go alone. She found Marcus Thorne in a drab, underfunded classroom, explaining the basics of accounts receivable to a handful of bored-looking students. He was a shadow of the ambitious executive his old profile picture suggested. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were perpetually tired, and he wore the weary resignation of a man who had been thoroughly broken by a system he once believed in. Akari waited until after his class, approaching him not with the aggression of an investigator but with the quiet respect of a fellow exile. She introduced herself by her full name, Akari Tanaka, and at the sound of that name, a flicker of recognition and then pure, undiluted fear flashed in his eyes. He immediately tried to shut her down, stammering about his NDA, insisting he knew nothing. He turned to walk away, his body language screaming his desire to flee. But Akari did not press him with questions or threats. Instead, she simply spoke of her grandfather, of the company he had built from nothing, of the pride and honor that had been the cornerstones of his life. She spoke of his stroke, and the hollowed-out shell he had become. She wasn't accusing Marcus of anything. She was simply bearing witness to the human cost of a crime he had been forced to watch unfold. Her quiet, dignified grief did what no legal threat could have accomplished. It pierced through the layers of fear and self-preservation that Marcus had built around himself. He stopped, his back still to her, and she saw his shoulders begin to shake. He had been a young, ambitious analyst when the Tanaka deal came across his desk. He had seen the irregularities, the deliberate undervaluation of assets, the coordinated media assault. He had tried to raise a red flag internally, a small act of professional courage. And for his troubles, he had been professionally and personally annihilated by Preston Hayes. He had been blacklisted from the industry, his reputation shredded, his career destroyed. For years he had lived with the silent shame and the gnawing fear, convinced he was a coward. In Akari's story, he saw not a threat, but a chance for a redemption he had long since given up on. He finally turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and a newfound fragile resolve. He told her he couldn't testify, that Hayes would destroy what little he had left. But there was something he could give her. A key. He explained that during the most sensitive phases of his acquisitions, Preston Hayes was paranoid about leaving a digital trail. He didn't trust the official company servers. For his most illegal communications, the direct orders and incriminating memos, he used a completely separate off-book server network. It was a ghost system, its existence known only to a handful of his most trusted inner circle. The IT staff who maintained it were paid through a shell corporation and bound by NDAs that were more like blood oaths. Marcus, as a risk analyst, had stumbled upon its digital signature once by accident, a brief glimpse into the abyss before his access was violently revoked. He didn't have passwords or access codes, but he remembered its architecture, its digital fingerprint. He called it the Leviathan. It was the place where Hayes kept his sins, a digital tomb that held the truth of what he had done to Tanaka Innovations and countless others. Marcus drew a crude schematic on a napkin, a map to a treasure chest of pure evil. Armed with this new, explosive information, Akari returned to the war room. The atmosphere, once thick with frustration, was now charged with a tense, electric excitement. Marcus's map was the Rosetta Stone they had been searching for. Croft immediately brought in a new member to their team, a legendary cybersecurity expert, a woman known in the clandestine world of white hat hacking only by her handle, Nyx. She was an artist whose medium was code, a digital phantom who could walk through firewalls and dance between encrypted servers without leaving a trace. She looked at the schematic Marcus had drawn, a small, wry smile playing on her lips. It was sloppy, she noted with professional disdain. Arrogant. Hayes had spent millions on lawyers to hide his crimes in the real world. But in the digital realm, his hubris had made him careless. He had built a fortress, but he had left a postern gate unguarded, convinced no one would ever be brave enough or smart enough to look for it. The digital infiltration of the Leviathan was not a chaotic, frantic affair. It was a slow, methodical, and nerve-wracking siege. For 72 straight hours, Nyx worked in a darkened room, her face illuminated only by the cascading green and white text on her multiple monitors. Akari, Croft, and the rest of the team kept a silent vigil, watching as she patiently tested for vulnerabilities, probed for weaknesses, and laid the groundwork for her assault. The tension was suffocating. At one point, a silent alarm was tripped deep within the server's security protocols. A red light flashed on one of Nyx's screens, and the entire team held its breath. They were certain they had been discovered, that in a matter of minutes, Hayes' own security team would trace their location. But Nyx remained unnaturally calm, her fingers flying across the keyboard in a blur of motion. She rerouted the alarm signal, cloaked their digital presence in a layer of false data, and slipped through the closing gate just as it was slamming shut. She was in. The moment they breached the final layer of encryption was not one of triumphant shouting, but of a deep, collective, and awe-filled silence. A file directory appeared on the main screen. It was deceptively simple, with folders labeled by year and acquisition target. Nyx navigated to a folder labeled Project Nightingale, the internal codename Apex had used for the Tanaka Innovations takeover. She clicked it open, and the screen filled with a list of documents. There were emails, audio files, and scanned memos, a complete, unvarnished record of the conspiracy. They found the direct order from Hayes to the ratings agency, promising them lucrative future contracts in exchange for a downgrade of Tanaka's stock. They found the payment records to the financial bloggers, a clear paper trail of the smear campaign, and then they found the crown jewel. It was a memo, written by Hayes himself, explicitly outlining the strategy to induce a stress event in Kenji Tanaka, speculating that the elderly founder's fragile health was a key vulnerability that could be exploited to force a panic sale. It was premeditated, calculated, and inhumanly cruel. It was the silver bullet. With the irrefutable proof in their possession, the entire dynamic of the war shifted. They were no longer the insurgents fighting a guerrilla war from the shadows. They were now an army on the verge of a final, decisive battle, and they held a weapon of mass destruction. The team gathered one last time in the war room, the atmosphere no longer one of desperate hope, but of cold, precise, and lethal certainty. Julian Croft, his face grim but his eyes alight with the thrill of the kill, laid out the final phase of the plan. He advised against going directly to the SEC or the Department of Justice. A federal investigation would be slow, and Hayes's legal team would bog it down in procedural delays for years, giving him time to hide his assets and control the narrative. Justice, Croft argued, needed to be swift, public, and absolute. They would not simply defeat Preston Hayes, they would annihilate him, using his own arrogance and his obsession with public perception as the instruments of his destruction. The plan was as elegant as it was ruthless. The first step was to create a crisis. Elena would leak a small, carefully selected portion of the evidence, just enough to suggest massive financial instability and executive malfeasance at Apex Holdings, to a trusted, high-profile journalist at the Wall Street Journal. The resulting story would trigger a catastrophic panic among investors. The stock price would plummet, forcing the board of directors to call an emergency shareholders meeting to address the crisis and reassure the market. This, Croft explained, would be their stage. This was where the public execution would take place. Preston Hayes, cornered and fighting for his corporate life, would be at his most vulnerable, forced to defend himself in a room full of his angry, terrified peers. He would be a wounded animal, and they were the hunters, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Akari's role in this final act was the most crucial. She would not be a silent observer or a source for a journalist. She would be the primary actor in the drama. In the days leading up to the meeting, using the vast resources of the Tanaka Family Trust, she began quietly and aggressively buying up shares of the now collapsing Apex Holdings stock. By the time of the emergency meeting, she would be one of its most significant new shareholders, giving her the legal right to stand and address the board, the press, and the man who had ruined her family. She would walk into that room not as a waitress, not as a victim, but as his equal, a titan of industry in her own right. She would confront him on his own turf, in the heart of his empire, armed with the truth he thought he had buried forever. The trap was set. The pieces were in place. Preston Hayes, watching his company's value evaporate and his reputation begin to tarnish, was completely consumed by the immediate crisis, never once suspecting that the architect of his downfall was the simple woman he had so cruelly dismissed and fired, a woman who was now coming to collect a debt that could only be paid in ruin. The emergency shareholders, meeting for Apex Holdings, was convened not in a room, but in a tomb. It was a cavernous, sterile amphitheater in the heart of their corporate headquarters, a space designed to intimidate and project invincibility. The walls were clad in cold, gray marble veined with black, and the lighting was a stark, unforgiving white that bleached all color from the faces of the assembled. The air, thick with the scent of fear and failing fortunes, was a stark contrast to the refined, truffle-scented atmosphere of the kintsugi room. Here, there was no pretense of civility. This was a gathering of a pack of wolves turning on their wounded leader. Preston Hayes stood at a podium at the center of it all, a solitary figure under the harsh glare of the spotlights. He looked smaller than he had in the restaurant, the bespoke suit that had once been his armor now hanging on him like a shroud. A fine sheen of sweat glistened on his brow as he attempted to project an aura of calm control, but his eyes, darting nervously across the sea of hostile faces, betrayed the sheer terror that was consuming him. He was a king presiding over the public dissolution of his own kingdom, and he had no idea the executioner was already in the room. The heavy oak doors at the back of the amphitheater swung open, a sound that cracked through the tense silence like a gunshot. Every head turned. A woman walked in, flanked by two lawyers whose severe expressions and perfectly tailored suits identified them as apex predators of the legal world. She was not dressed in the anonymous black uniform of a servant, but in a dark navy power suit of such exquisite tailoring it seemed to have been woven from shadow and steel. Her stride was not the silent, gliding step of a waitress, but a measured, confident pace that consumed the space before her. As she walked down the central aisle, the whispers followed her like a ripple in a dark pond. No one knew who she was, but her presence radiated an authority so absolute, so innate, that it instantly eclipsed that of the man floundering at the podium. Akari Tanaka did not look at the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on a single target, Preston Hayes. As their gazes met across the room, she saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, a vague, unsettling sense of familiarity he couldn't quite place. He saw a powerful woman, a threat, but he did not yet see the ghost of his past, the architect of his present, and the harbinger of his future. She did not wait to be recognized. As she reached the front row, a space that had been cleared for her by a silent, pre-arranged agreement with several key board members, she took a microphone from an aide. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was amplified by the room's acoustics and carried a clarity that cut through the murmuring and demanded absolute attention. Good morning, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Akari Tanaka. The name hung in the air, and this time the effect on Preston Hayes was not one of confusion, but of a sudden, violent, and sickening recognition. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of horror. He finally saw her. He saw the waitress from the kintsugi room, but she was superimposed with the specter of a name he had tried to bury 5 years ago. He opened his mouth to object, to call for security, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed by the impossible reality unfolding before him. The board, however, was now listening with rapt attention. The name Tanaka, connected to the rumors of fraud that were gutting their stock price, was the key to the entire crisis. Akari continued, her voice a calm, dispassionate instrument of destruction. I am the acting head of the Tanaka Global Fund, and as of 7 a.m. this morning, we are the second largest shareholder in this company. A collective gasp went through the room. She had used the panic he had created to buy her way into his fortress. She then gestured to a massive screen behind the podium, where the Apex Holdings logo had been proudly displayed. The logo vanished, replaced by a series of documents, bank statements from Cayman Islands accounts, internal memos, and email chains. With the cold precision of a surgeon, she walked the board through the entire conspiracy to defraud Tanaka Innovations. She did not raise her voice or betray a single flicker of personal emotion. She simply presented the evidence, an irrefutable, data-driven narrative of his crimes. She laid bare the secret payments, the coordinated media manipulation, the deliberate undervaluation of assets. The story she told was not one of a hostile takeover. It was one of a meticulous, predatory, and criminal heist. The room grew colder, the silence more profound, with every slide she presented. The final piece of evidence was not a document. Akari paused, letting the weight of the financial data settle into the horrified minds of her audience. And while the theft of a $50 billion company is a significant crime, she said, her voice dropping slightly, it is perhaps not the most telling indictment of the character of the man who leads this corporation. Character, after all, is the ultimate collateral. And in the case of Mr. Hayes, the debt is long past due. On the screen behind him, the documents vanished, replaced by a simple audio file player. A single click from her lawyer's laptop, and the sound of Preston Hayes' own voice filled the silent amphitheater. His arrogant, condescending words from the kintsugi room echoed off the cold marble walls. They heard his mockery of the Japanese investors. They heard his racist slurs. And they heard, with chilling clarity, his final dismissive insult, simple jobs for simple minds. It was his soul, laid bare for the world to see, and it was uglier and more rotten than any financial crime could ever be. The recording was his confession, his indictment, and his eulogy, all in one. The silence that followed the recording was the most profound silence Preston Hayes had ever known. It was the sound of his entire world ending. It was the sound of every door slamming shut, of every bridge being burned, of every ally turning into an enemy. He stood at the podium, a statue carved from pure humiliation, the carefully constructed persona of the invincible corporate titan, the master of the universe, had not just been cracked, it had been vaporized, leaving behind nothing but the small, cruel, and pathetic man he truly was. He looked out at the faces of his board members, the men and women who had once feared and revered him, and he saw nothing but cold, unadulterated contempt. He turned his gaze, as if drawn by some morbid gravity, back to Akari. She was no longer looking at him, she had already dismissed him, just as he had once dismissed her. She was now addressing the board, her work with him complete. He was no longer a player in the game. He was simply a piece being removed from the board, a casualty of a war he never even knew he was fighting. The great Preston Hayes had been undone not by a rival billionaire or a government regulator, but by the invisible waitress he had wronged, the ghost he had created. The downfall was swift and brutally efficient. The chairman of the board, a man whose career Hayes had made, stood up and, without a single glance in Hayes's direction, called for an immediate vote of no confidence. The motion was seconded by a dozen voices at once. The vote was unanimous. Security guards who had been waiting discreetly by the exits began to move toward the stage, their presence a quiet, final confirmation of his utter ruin. The press, who had been held back, surged forward, their cameras flashing like a firing squad, capturing the final, ignominious moments of a fallen god. Preston Hayes did not rage or scream. There was no fight left in him. All the arrogance, all the fury had been hollowed out, leaving only a vast, empty void of despair. He was escorted from the stage, a ghost in his own life, walking past the woman who had so completely and systematically destroyed him, his vacant eyes seeing nothing. His empire was gone, his reputation was shattered, his freedom was a rapidly expiring commodity. Justice had not just been served, it had been delivered with the cold, serene, and inescapable finality of a blade to the heart. Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Preston Hayes' own words became his downfall. 6 months later, the name Preston Hayes was a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms he once dominated. He was buried under a mountain of federal indictments and civil lawsuits, his assets frozen, his legacy reduced to a permanent stain of disgrace. In his place, a new empire was rising, one built not on the rubble of his old one, but on an entirely different foundation. The headquarters of the newly reformed Tanaka Innovations was not a cold monument to power, but a space designed to foster creativity and honor. Natural light flooded the offices through vast windows, illuminating walls adorned not with abstract art, but with photographs celebrating the company's history and its employees. Akari Tanaka, as CEO, led not from a throne on a high floor, but from an accessible office in the heart of the building. Her leadership style was a reflection of her grandfather's philosophy, patience, respect, and an unwavering belief that a company's greatest asset was not its stock price, but its people and its integrity. She was not just rebuilding a corporation, she was restoring a soul. Her first act as CEO had been to re-establish the company's original pension plan, which Hayes had gutted, and to offer jobs back to every single employee he had laid off during his brutal asset-stripping campaign. Her second act was to create a charitable foundation funded by a significant portion of the company's profits, dedicated to supporting victims of corporate fraud. She was not a conqueror seeking spoils. She was a healer, using her newfound power to mend the wounds that men like Hayes inflicted upon the world. She had taken the poison of her family's tragedy and transmuted it into a powerful antidote, proving that true strength was not in the ability to destroy, but in the will to rebuild. The world of finance, so often driven by greed and fear, watched in stunned silence as a new model of success began to emerge, one founded on the radical idea that honor was not a liability, but the most valuable commodity of all. On a quiet afternoon, Akari left the bustling world of her new life behind and drove to the peaceful care facility where her grandfather resided. She found him sitting in a garden, his gaze distant but calm. The fire of the titan he once was had been banked, but in his eyes, a gentle, knowing light still flickered. She sat beside him, not speaking for a long time, simply sharing the silence. She then took out a freshly printed annual report, the first for the restored Tanaka Innovations. On the cover was a picture of the original factory her grandfather had built with his own hands 60 years ago. She placed it gently in his lap. His hand, frail and trembling, moved to touch the image. A single tear traced a path down the weathered landscape of his cheek. He looked up at his granddaughter, and for the first time in 5 long years, a slow, faint smile touched his lips. No words were needed. He knew. His legacy was safe. His honor had been restored. Akari's journey, which had begun in the darkness of grief and a thirst for justice, had finally come full circle, ending here, in the quiet light of a garden, with an act of love. She had learned the ultimate lesson her grandfather had tried to teach her, that the greatest victory is not in vanquishing your enemies, but in becoming the person your ancestors would be proud of. If Akari Tanaka's incredible journey from an invisible waitress to an unstoppable force of justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.